60 seconds. For a younger person, we can go a little higher intensity. So what would that do with our duration?
I think I had some neural tension in my throat because my throat was going to sleep.
Well, that and elevation too could have had a contribution to that. But to stay on this point, I can stretch him a little harder because he's younger. So I'm going to do 30-second sessions, right? Now look, we've already got him a little bit of range because what we did was we woke up those muscle spindles and said, okay, you guys calm down. Now, with that, what I do is I just continue my stretch. Stretch, 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 stretch. And that's a static stretch. It's maintained, it's sustained, it's prolonged, it's held, right? Those are all the verbs that we said describe a static stretch. Now, from there, I could move into something called a ballistic stretch. A ballistic stretch is probably not something done passively, though. The reason why is because you're taking a unstretched, loose muscle and you're basically applying rapid, short duration stretches successively to it. And so you've seen these before. These are the people who are doing this, right? And I'm not even going to do it because I'm scared I'm going to hurt my back, to be honest with you, right? And that's a ballistic stretch. And by virtue of the text, when you read the definition, which is where we left off this morning in class, you'll see that the definition says it's a repetitive, bouncing type stretch. Now, does it have a role? Sure it does. Sure it does. Probably closer to the pre-exercise level. It's not going to do a lot for range. What it is going to do is just kind of get that muscle a little bit more ready for exercise. In fact, when we talk about aerobic conditioning, we'll move therefore into dynamic stretching, where we'll be doing exercises or stretches like the monster walk. And that is certainly more of a ballistic style. And they cannot really come to terms in the literature yet and break dynamic and ballistic apart in a good way. So we're not going to try to do that either. We're just going to kind of lump them in the same. So ballistic does have a role, and it does have a part, especially if you use it in a dynamic warm-up setting. The next, go ahead.
So static is done after workouts and ballistic will be before workouts?
We're going to consistently tell you, and I'll show you the literature, that we want to do a static stretch post-activity because its design is to increase range. And what better time to increase range than when a muscle is full of blood and supple, and also probably at its peak physiological temperature from exercise. That's the safest time. All right, next on my list, cyclic. Let me grab, because I want to give you that definition directly. So for cyclic,
I have it.
on page 80,
No.
no,
You don't have to add.
it says a relatively short duration stretch force that is repeated but gradually applied, released and then reapplied. The difference between cyclic and difference between cyclic and ballistic, where ballistic is very rapid, and you saw what I was doing actively for my stretch. A cyclic would be more like this right here. Okay, we're taking them in, and we're not as aggressive as ballistic. It's kind of a mid-intensity. Where static is a low intensity, cyclic is kind of a mid-intensity.
It's like a prolonged ballistic.
Like a slower ballistic. Yeah. And ballistic would be like a high intensity but very short duration. So what we've done is we've really spanned all of the inverse relationship. Static meaning low load, long duration here. Ballistic being more of a high load, very low duration, right? With that. And then we got in the middle with our cyclic. Now we've reached kind of the end here. And we're at a point where we have to look at this one called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Now I don't want you to get hung up in the words, except for I do want you to hear this neuromuscular. So we're going to go nerve into muscle. You feel good about that? And earlier today, I said something about how these muscles, they have something embedded in them to detect length change called the muscle spindle. You remember that? And the muscle spindle does what? Help me remember.
It stops it from stretching, or from lengthening.
What it does is, let's kind of give it a little more physiology. It contracts the muscle when it detects a substantial length change that's rapid. So like think about slipping on that wet spot in the floor, right? And the muscle changes length rapidly. So the muscle spindle's there and it says, whoop, back up. Well, when you stretch a patient, you're going to elicit that muscle length change. The muscle spindle here in this muscle is going to be like, whoa, 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 wait just a second. So some really smart therapists who were already developing this whole proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation technique, they jumped onto this and they said, hey, there's this thing we can utilize. One of my favorite sayings is, when you can't change your circumstances, change your perspective, right? So you're going to deal with muscle spindles. How can you use them for your advantage? And they thought about it, they scratched their head and they said, got it. When this muscle right here contracts, the muscle spindles of this muscle back off. Why? Because they have to. The antagonist has to lengthen. That happens in your brain and spinal. It doesn't even go to your brain. It goes right to your spinal cord. The stretch reflex happens at your spinal cord level. Never goes to your brain. So, that being said, these really smart therapists, they were like, oh, gotcha. We're going to call this reciprocal inhibition. And because the muscle spindles in this muscle that we're trying to stretch shut down when this muscle is active, we're going to create this stretching schematic that brings that into play. And we're going to call it a really fancy name. We're going to call it agonist contract. Now, don't even write that. Just listen to them. Did you hear the words I just said? We're going to call it agonist contract. Now, let's just see what happens. I want this muscle lengthened, right? We've all been talking about that hamstring all day long. Been talking about this hamstring, muscle spindles. Now we're going to do a stretch called agonist contract. Well, here's what they're going to do. They said, okay, we stretch this guy for 30 seconds. That's what the research tells us. The muscle spindles don't like, they'll just kind of calm down after that, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, agonist, can you pick your leg up and pull that in? Contract. Holy crap. What's happening? The agonists are contracting. Remember, the antagonist is the range limiting muscle. It's the muscle that should lengthen, but when they don't, it's because these are tight. Relax for me. Back out of it, and look at the new range. Why? All we did was we fooled his brain. We didn't really. We just employed on the strengths that we had. Couldn't change our circumstances, so we changed our perspective and said, go. That's agonist contract.
So you have them do it themselves, and then you can take it farther.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, by virtue of the definition, agonist contract is asking the agonist, which is opposite the antagonist, to contract. I mean, I cannot give you a simpler definition. As long as you're good, now listen, therapist, this is really critical. As long as you're good with these right here, you're good with the agonist contract. I can definitely tell you this is a complicated, nasty thing to read. So don't try to go too deep with it unless you're already solid right here.
What is MM should lengthen?
Muscle. MM is muscle.
Oh.
That's just an abbreviation for muscle. You didn't get enough time with Bill to see that, but he will consistently write MM. They also had another one. They were like, wait a second, I can one up this. I mean, these guys were smart. In fact, if you open your neuro book, chapter 9, it's dedicated to this whole concept. And we're not done after this in Ther Ex. I got more to say. So, they were like, now, this muscle, if it contracts, the agonist, it gets this muscle spindle to calm down. That's pretty much kinesiology 101. Let's go to kinesiology 102. This muscle has muscle spindles. We need it to stretch out and lengthen. What do you say we try stretching that muscle for 30 seconds, getting that muscle spindle to calm down? Let's really override the system. Let's make that muscle contract. Push into my shoulder. 5, 4, come on, push. I thought you said you worked legs last week. Relax. And then we stretch again. Now how are we doing?
That's pretty good.
I want to see how far you can go.
I like Rosie's enthusiasm. Let's see how far we can take this. That gas tank's been on E for an hour. Let's keep driving, baby. Too much?
Right there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's like right here.
Go and relax.
Something snapped, I think.
I'll blame Rosie. Push on me again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. Now, let me ask you something. Put it in your brain here. Let's go all the way with this. He's pushing on me. What kind of muscle contractions you got?
That was just concentric or eccentric with gravity.
Keep guessing. There's one more option. Isometric. When his leg was right here and he was pushing, right? That's isometric. Now, if I said you get one word to describe to a patient that you're wanting to do isometrics with, what one word would you say to that person? What's the one word you'd say to that person?
To describe it?
You get one word to say, this is what I want you to do.
Squeeze.
I gotta push,
Hold.
hold. I like hold. And these therapists, they were like, got an idea for the name. We're gonna call this one hold, relax. Because did you see what they did? Hold this and then relax and let me stretch you. And so they created these two techniques. Now, since then, there's been kind of a graduation of that, where they did bring in concentric. And so what we did was we stretched this out and held it for 30 seconds, and then said not hold, but push. Push. Go ahead, push. Push. And they let them contract through a partial or full range of motion, relax. And they call that contract, relax. So
just hold, relax. They're not pushing against you. They're just holding it there.
No, I was pushing
No,
it
it's
down.
It would just hold because it was isometric.
So hold and relax and contract and relax are the same thing, right? Or no?
Contracted is when it comes
Just
down.
bring that down with them. to the-
hang on, I'm going to give you the whole thing. Alright, so with P and F, we're going to first describe these two. Number one is your hold and relax, or your hold and relax. This is, you take the range limiting muscle, also known as the antagonist. You perform a 30-second stretch. And then you ask that range limiting muscle to do an isometric contraction for 5 seconds, and then you repeat your static stretch. Right? What I did was, I walked over here. I stretched him. Right there. The range limiting muscle. 30-second stretch. Okay? I take him out of that stretch just a little because I don't want to start from the end range. I want him to start from a mid range. I say go ahead and push on me for 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax. That does not have to be a max contraction. That should be submaximal, especially in your older people, right? And then I take him in to stretch again. And then I just repeat that simple process maybe 3 or 4 times. Then I do an agonist contract. And I can do one of these or both of these or maybe a combination. In fact, in your text, it will give you the hold, relax, agonist contract method. It says it just like that. You don't have to do it that way. You take the range limiting muscle. You do about a 30-second static stretch. And then you ask the agonist, because remember the range limiting muscle is what?
Antagonist.
Is the antagonist. You ask the agonist to contract, which is basically them doing the work to stretch the muscle, times 5 seconds, and then you repeat the static stretch. It's simple as that. Now the question is this: where can thou apply these techniques? You could do it to a patient who comes in and says, I can't turn my head and look to the right. Here's my theory, or here's my application, sorry. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say, okay, have a seat. They're gonna sit, and I'm gonna say, you can't turn your head to the right, correct? And they're gonna say, right. Or they might just say, it really hurts when I try to look that way. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stretch them into that, right there. And if I wanted to use agonist contract, what would I do? I'd say, now you try to turn your head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, relax, and then the passive static stretch applies. Or I go with the hold relax. And what is that? Can't take and turn my head? Okay. So, now you got to watch to pay attention on this one. I stretch them into this motion, and then I don't even change my hand position. I say, now go ahead and turn your head to the left, and they do. Now again, do you know how bad these things hurt around your neck? This is sub-maximal contraction. You've got to cue that as a therapist. Say really lightly, push into my hands. I was giving him kind of a hard time. Did you hear me say, can you push a little bit harder? It's not necessary. Because any contraction elicits the inhibition of the antagonist's muscle spindles. It just does. And when you get into neuro, you're really going to see where all this comes to play by using it against tone and spasticity. So there you go. Lay it on me.
Are those, is that like a progression, or do you just do both of them?
The only thing that progresses is this. Start with static. That way you can test the waters. You always want to kind of go with the low load, long duration. If they work into that pretty well and they're not having problems, on their second or third time in, I'd kick it on up. I would. I really would. Sometimes I'm a little more aggressive than that. And we're going to use it a little more quicker. It all comes down to clinical decision making. What you got to leave here knowing is what a static stretch is, what a ballistic stretch is, what the intermediate cyclic stretch is, and then you got to know what PNF is, what a hold relax is, and what an agonist contract is.
How do we define the PNF then? Is just all those two?
PNF goes a lot deeper as far as, in fact, I'll just go ahead and, on page 93, yes sir. On page 93 in the book, it talks about what a proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation stretching technique is. And it says these are sometimes referred to as facilitation or active stretching, but it doesn't give a definition specific to PNF. In the second paragraph, it does describe this term that I used, reciprocal inhibition. And then underneath that, it will say types of PNF stretching, and it will give you hold relax. It also will give you contract relax. And again, I did not put that one in here because most literature agrees that contract relax is the same as hold relax, only instead of having an isometric contraction, there's a concentric contraction, which means there's movement. There's more on page 94 and 95 that talks more about those two things. but before we go any further, what I want you
In
guys
the
to do
parentheses.
is I want you to jump
Concentric.
into your groups. I want you to get your hands on each other, and I want you stretching hamstrings, quads, shoulders, and on the shoulders, go ahead and do flexion, abduction, and external rotation. Now remember, they all have full range of motion probably, so don't push the limits to pain. Also, go ahead and grab a cervical spine, because I really like you guys holding heads. I think that's a very important skill. Grab the cervical spine, so shoulder, shoulder, spine, C-spine,
Quad.
hip, and quads and hamstrings, yeah.